For months, Tommaso Cioni said absolutely nothing, not a single word, no denial, no explanation, no carefully worded statement passed through a publicist. While the world filled in the blanks on its own, while headlines ran in directions nobody could have predicted, while strangers who had never been in the same room as him formed hard opinions about who he was and what he had done, he stayed completely, almost painfully, quiet. Some people looked at that silence and saw guilt, others looked at it and saw grief. A few sat with the discomfort of not knowing and quietly wondered whether something far more complicated was living underneath the surface, something that couldn't be flattened into a headline, something that resisted the clean, satisfying shape that people tend to want when a story breaks. Annie Guthrie's name had already been moving through conversations for a long time before any of this reached its peak. She was someone people felt they understood or believed they did. Someone whose story had turned in ways that nobody anticipated, in directions that left a residue of unanswered questions wherever it went. And somewhere along the way, Tommaso's name had become woven into hers, attached, inseparable almost, two names said together in the same breath, carrying the same weight. Then he spoke. Not the way anyone expected, not through lawyers, not through a polished press release designed to minimize damage. He spoke the way a person speaks when something has been sitting on their chest for so long that silence stops being an option. When the weight of staying quiet finally becomes heavier than the weight of being heard. What came out of that silence wasn't explosive in any theatrical sense. It was something quieter than that, and because of that, far more unsettling. It was layered. It was raw in the way that only real things are raw. It contradicted some of what people had assumed. It confirmed other things. And when it was over, it left people sitting with questions they hadn't quite expected to be left holding. This is that story from the very beginning. Before the noise arrived, before the speculation took on a life of its own, before everything became too loud and too public to contain, there were simply two people living their lives. That's the part that tends to disappear when a story reaches the scale this one reached. When names transform into symbols, when people become narratives that the public feels entitled to, the actual human beings underneath all of it quietly vanish. Their ordinary days. The unremarkable choices they made when no one was watching. The version of themselves that existed before the world decided who they were going to be. Tommaso Cioni, by most accounts, was someone who understood what it meant to earn something slowly. People who knew him before any of this described a man who was driven, but not in the kind of way that announced itself. He had ambitions. He carried them quietly, without needing to perform them for an audience. There was a confidence in that, not the loud, brittle kind, but the slow, earned kind that tends to leave a lasting impression on the people who witness it up close. That kind of person tends to attract a very specific type of attention, not always the kind they're looking for. Annie Guthrie moved through the world differently, but with a comparable depth. The people closest to her described a woman who felt things with an intensity that most of the people around her couldn't quite keep up with. She was intuitive in a way that sometimes made others uncomfortable. She was sharp, and she had a particular ability to see past what people chose to show, down into what they were actually carrying. She had built something real in her life, a sense of direction, a community of people who trusted her voice, a purpose that felt genuinely and completely her own. When their worlds eventually overlapped, something formed in the space between them that the people watching couldn't quite name. Relationship felt too simple. Friendship didn't hold the full weight of it, partnership missed something, rivalry came close in some moments but not others. The people who witnessed them together most often described something that resisted labeling, a push and pull, a warmth layered with friction, a closeness that was also in certain quiet ways. A tension. For a while, none of that tension was anyone else's business. It lived in the private world they shared, in conversations that happened away from cameras and comment sections, in the small circle of people who were actually present. It wasn't a story yet. It was just two complicated people navigating something genuinely human in the way that people do when they don't yet know they're being watched. But something changed, something always does. And when it did, the world was already watching. From the outside, for a long time, things appeared functional, stable even. Tommaso had found a kind of footing, building carefully, intentionally, one piece placed thoughtfully on top of the last. His life had the quality of something constructed with real patience. Not the performed stability that people curate for public consumption, but the kind that comes from actual decisions made over actual stretches of time. Annie's life in its own way reflected a similar groundedness. She had shaped a space for herself that felt distinctly hers. Her voice had an audience, and that audience had extended her a real and fragile trust. The kind of trust that accumulates slowly and can be lost in a single afternoon. She knew the weight of it. Together, or at least in the same orbit, they gave the appearance of something that was working. People around them recalled genuine warmth between them. Laughter. Serious conversations that went somewhere real. Disagreements that resolved without leaving permanent damage. The unremarkable, necessary texture of a dynamic between two people who respected each other, even in the moments when that respect was difficult to access. But underneath that surface, according to people who were present during this period, something else was quietly accumulating. Small pressures at first. The kind that don't arrive with any announcement. The kind that feel completely manageable until the morning they no longer do. There were conversations happening behind closed doors, about expectations, about boundaries, about what each of them actually needed from what they had built together, and about whether those needs were ever truly going to align. None of it was dramatic. That matters. Drama tends to be the lens we apply in retrospect, once we already know the ending and we're working backwards to find where things began to split. In real time, it was simply two people doing their best with the tools they had. Sometimes those tools were sufficient. Sometimes they fell short in ways neither of them had words for yet. Looking back, it's clear that the foundation, solid as it appeared from the outside, had quiet fault lines running through it. And fault lines, given time and enough accumulated pressure, eventually make themselves known. No one has been able to identify a single moment when things shifted. That's not how it happens. There's rarely a clean line that divides before from after. Instead, there was a stretch, weeks, possibly longer, depending on who you ask, when something in the space between Tommaso and Annie began to feel different. Not dramatically different. Just different enough that the people around them started to sense it without being able to name it. Not because either of them said anything directly, but because silence between people who were once close has its own texture, and that texture had changed. According to reports that surfaced later, there had been an incident, or more accurately, a series of smaller moments, that had begun to quietly erode the trust between them. The specific details of what happened remained and in many ways continue to remain disputed. That word is worth pausing on, disputed. Not because the truth was entirely out of reach, but because the truth in situations like this one tends to look genuinely different depending on where a person was standing when they experienced it. From Tommaso's side, based on what he would eventually choose to share, there was a growing sense that something about him had been misrepresented. That a version of who he was had been assembled and circulated without his input, and that this version didn't match the one he recognized. That things he had said, choices he had made, had been absorbed and given meanings he never put into them. From Annie's side, the picture that formed through the people around her was one of someone who felt that certain lines had been crossed. That things shared in confidence had not been held with the care they deserved. That her experience of certain moments had been minimized or simply not believed. Both of these things can be true at the same time. That's the part that gets quietly erased when a story moves into public territory. The possibility that two people can each carry a version of events that feels entirely and completely real to them, and that both versions can contain genuine truth, even when they don't align. What the fracture introduced, regardless of its precise edges, was wariness. And wariness, once it moves into the space between two people, changes everything that follows it, every conversation. Every silence, every interaction carries a new and heavier weight. Private fractures, as a rule, don't remain private. The pressure builds until the boundary holding everything in simply gives way. That's what happened here. There was no single deliberate moment of exposure. It was more like water finding a crack, slow, patient, and eventually inevitable. People started talking. And in the absence of real information, speculation filled the space with remarkable speed and confidence. Questions were raised about what had actually happened between them, some with genuine curiosity, some with something less generous underneath. Because both Tommaso and Annie were known to people who had never actually met them, those questions traveled faster than anything either of them could manage. Tommaso's silence during this period became a subject of intense analysis on its own. Some people read it as calculated. The kind of silence someone maintains when they've been legally advised to say nothing. Others read it as the stillness of someone genuinely stunned, someone who had watched a private difficulty become a public event and hadn't yet found language that felt adequate for the scale of it. Annie's experience during this time had its own particular difficulty. She was at the center of a story that she hadn't fully authored, but couldn't step away from either. What was being said about her, some of it kind, some of it genuinely cruel, was visible to her in real time. There was nowhere to escape the noise. What happens to two people when their private pain becomes public property is something that deserves to be understood slowly. The pressure is unlike almost anything else. It alters how they're able to move through their own experience, because processing anything real requires a degree of privacy. A protected interior space where a person can feel something without an audience watching and interpreting and deciding what it means. Both of them lost access to that space, and the loss of it more than almost anything else is what accelerated everything that came next. When Tommaso finally spoke, the reaction was almost uniform surprise, not because of any theatrical revelation but because of how specific he was. How grounded, how careful. In being those things, he changed the shape of the story in ways that the speculation had never managed to touch. According to his account, shared in a setting he had deliberately chosen, there were dimensions to his experience that had never surfaced in any of the public conversation. What he described was quieter than what people had imagined, more interior. More painful in the specific, private ways that pain tends to be when it doesn't translate neatly into language designed for online spaces. He spoke about what it felt like to have his character defined by people who had never asked him a single question. About watching a narrative form around him that contained fragments of real events, but arranged them in ways that changed their meaning entirely. Those who heard him speak during this time described someone who had clearly spent a long time with these thoughts, not performing them, but arriving at them slowly and with genuine difficulty. He was careful not to make broad accusations. He wasn't interested in performing anger. He came across, by most accounts, as someone who had finally decided that honesty was the only thing left worth offering. What he said about Annie was the part that surprised people most. The question everyone had been anticipating, was he angry at her? Did he hold her responsible? Received an answer that didn't fit the shape of the conflict people had been expecting. It wasn't anger, it was something closer to grief. A layered, complicated grief sitting alongside a quiet but clear determination to reclaim his own account of what had happened. He acknowledged responsibility in the conversation in a way that people almost never do publicly, without using that acknowledgement to diminish what else he was saying. According to those present, it was genuinely difficult to witness, because it was real, and real things in public settings are rarer than they should be. After someone speaks with that kind of honesty, there is always a period where everything has to settle and recalibrate. The people who had held firm, clear opinions about where blame resided found themselves sitting with something more complicated than their positions had allowed. That's genuinely uncomfortable. A clean story is so much easier to hold than one that asks you to make room for multiple truths existing at the same time. But complexity is almost always what's actually underneath, under the headlines, under the takes, under the verdict that everyone rushed to deliver. Annie had not spoken publicly by the time the weight of Tommaso's words had moved through the conversation and settled into something more permanent. Her silence in the wake of his speaking carried its own significance, though what that significance meant remained, as it had throughout, a matter of interpretation. Some believed she was preparing something of her own. Others felt her silence was the most complete response available to her. A few wondered whether what he had said had landed somewhere too close to be answered quickly. What was clear was that nothing had resolved. Resolution, the genuine kind, the kind that closes a chapter and allows people to move forward, was still somewhere in the uncertain distance, if it existed at all. Some things between people never truly resolve. They shift and evolve. They become something both people carry in different ways over time, changed in shape but never entirely set down. The people around both of them had been caught in the undertow too. Friendships had been tested by the quiet, constant pressure of being asked to take sides in something none of them fully understood from the inside. Professional relationships had developed new and uncomfortable tensions. Trust, slow to build, quick to damage, had been strained across an entire network of people who had simply had the misfortune of being nearby when everything broke open. And the public, watching from its own considerable distance, had developed its own relationship with the story, with its loose ends and undelivered closure. There's something about a story that refuses to conclude neatly, that won't offer up a verdict or a tidy resolution, that settles differently in the mind than one that does. It stays open. It keeps asking something of you. It resists being filed away. That might be the most truthful description of where things stood, genuinely heavily unfinished. There is a version of this story that would have been much easier to tell. A version with clear roles, a defined villain, a satisfying conclusion where someone is held accountable and someone else is vindicated. And the whole thing lands cleanly with a sense of justice delivered. That version would be simpler to watch, simpler to close the window on and walk away from without carrying anything, but it isn't the story that actually exists. What actually exists is two people, both real, both deeply complicated, both deserving of being understood as human beings rather than symbols, who built something together and then watched it fracture in ways that neither of them could fully predict or control, who found themselves at the center of a public conversation that was larger and louder and less nuanced than anything either of them had prepared for, who each held a version of the truth that felt completely real, because it was real, and yet didn't perfectly align with the other person's version. Tommaso speaking finally, after so much carefully maintained silence, didn't resolve anything, but it did something that matters more than resolution in certain moments. It gave him back his humanity in a story that had been slowly reducing him to a role. And in doing that, it quietly extended the same invitation to anyone watching. To see Annie not as a character either, but as a person, not as an accusation, as a reminder, behind every public story there are people, people who carry more than is visible. People who make mistakes and sometimes understand why, and sometimes don't. People who feel wronged and responsible and confused and certain all in the same breath. The stories we tell about them, and more importantly, how we choose to tell those stories, say something real about who we are too. Whether we approach what we don't understand with the desire to reach a verdict, or with the slower, harder desire to actually understand. Whether we can hold something complex without needing it to become simple. Whether we're willing to see the person behind the headline instead of letting the headline be all there is. No official conclusion has been reached about many of the deeper questions this story raised. Questions have been raised, accounts have differed, and the full picture, if one exists at all, remains genuinely unclear. That's uncomfortable, but it's honest. What stays when everything else has shifted is the weight of what was finally said, the fact that it was said at all after so much silence. And the quiet, demanding truth that real understanding, not the performed kind, but the kind that costs something, requires a willingness to sit with uncertainty. To stay in the difficult middle a little longer, to resist the pull of the easy answer, that takes patience. It takes a particular kind of courage. And it takes the kind of empathy that doesn't ask for anything comfortable in return. If this story stayed with you, not just as a story about two people, but as something that made you think about how we watch and judge and decide, sit with that for a moment. Leave a thought in the comments, not a verdict, a thought. What part of this stayed with you? What question are you still carrying? This channel exists for stories like this one, the ones that don't resolve cleanly, told for the people willing to sit honestly inside the complexity. If that's you, subscribe. There's more to come.